Welcome back to Greg's Maker Corner. In this video, I'm going to be covering the assembly of the turtleneck, the final general assembly, kind of getting everything wrapped up. I'm also going to demonstrate how to flash the firmware on the AFC Lite. Stay tuned, and thanks again for watching Greg's Maker Corner. And moving along here, we've got the turtleneck, and you're going to need 4 heat inserts in this part. I've got my soldering iron heated up. There's the first one. And we'll just repeat this for these 4 spots, and there's the completed heat inserts. Make sure you get these all flush with the part. For the next part, you're going to need the slide and the frame, and probably your last couple of couplers here. You may have one left like me, and make sure you remove this bumper, little plastic piece on the end here. And we're just going to be inserting these flush with the part into here, and you may need a mallet. You may just be able to insert them in. I'm going to just try and gently push here. Yeah, that went in pretty easy. Do the same with this part. And now I've got both pieces in, and make sure they're flush. The collars are flush to the part like that. Right, you are going to need to find your buffer 1 and buffer 2 switches. These switches that you're going to need are going to be in this TN buffer and BT hard mounts bag. That's where I found mine. And you're also going to find your M2 self-tapping screws in here, which we're going to need to secure these switches. Something else you're going to need to do is find your Omron D2FL switch in your filamatrix bag if you're using the LDO kit. These switches need to have levers on them for this part, and they don't, so you do need to remove these. These don't need to have levers on them. Just gently pinch, and they should come out pretty easily, just like that. And you need 2 of them, so we're going to go ahead and borrow this other one as well. And just be careful when you're removing those so you don't lose them. Especially if you're using pliers, they do tend to fly off. So now we're going to insert them. So we're going to come in here and we're going to just pinch it. Things are so tiny and awkward. Pinch it in place. There we go. For these M2 screws, you're going to need a 1.5 driver. And go ahead and align these like this. This first one goes here, and you may have to twist the screw through. And you will see the little hole in the plastic part. Just try to aim for that. And don't over tighten it. Once you feel it hit and it's snug, then you're good. And now I'll put the other one in, and it's going to go the opposite way. And it doesn't really matter which label you use. These are the exact same wire length. I would recommend doing buffer 1 and then buffer 2. That's how mine are labeled. All right, so I'm putting the buffer 2 switch right next to it, inverted. So the switch, the levers like this. And then you're going to just do the same thing pretty much. And I recommend holding it this way when you're screwing it in so it's easier to twist in. And once you get these snugged up, just finish them up with these other 2 screws. And just make sure there's no gaps in between the switch and the part, and you should be in good shape. And there we have buffer 1 and buffer 2. And for this next part, we're just going to set this in with the fin in that slot. Just slide it all the way back, like so. And then set that part down. And we're going to just secure this, just like that. And close it up. And it should snap together just like that. I'm just going to secure this in place with 4 M3/8 screws. And just make sure everything's nice and snug. And this is why they call it the turtleneck. Go ahead and play around with it if you want. We're going to be working on these trigger retainers. You're going to need your 4 triggers, self-tapping screws, M2x10s, and the remaining switches. And these are all going to have a label prep 1 through 4. And this is the orientation that you want to have. So you got your trigger piece here, you've got your switch here, and you want to make sure that it's mounted like that. We're going to go ahead and put those M2 screws in here now and secure it. And then once it's inserted, just hold it on top of the trigger. Make sure the orientation is correct, like this. And we're just going to sink those in. And then we'll go ahead and add our second screw. And there is your completed part. And just go ahead and repeat that for the remaining 3. And once you're done with that, just confirm that everything is oriented properly. So they should look like this. The other thing to check, make sure all of your switches are flush on the bottom and that all these screw heads are completely flush to the switch. Like this one, I noticed there's a little bit of a gap, so I need to tighten that one a little bit more. There we go. It's always good to just double check everything before you keep going. Go ahead and get your AFC Lite board out. And you're also going to need your steppers. And then we'll go ahead and remove these and attach to the board. It doesn't matter which ones you use, just make sure you get the orientation correct. So you'll notice there's a little bit of these 3 pins here that come over. This can only pretty much go in one way. These 3 pins go here, and you insert it in, and then you just repeat for the next 3. Just make sure everything's lined up before you press down, so you don't want any bent pins. And just double check everything's nice and lined up. Next up, we're going to put in the heat sinks. I'm going to go ahead and remove the blue film here. Just when you're setting this in, be sure you center it as much as you can and make sure you're not hitting any of the pins or shorting out on any of that. So that's pretty much what you want it to look like. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. And I'm just going to repeat that for the next 3. That looks pretty good. Get it generally in the center and don't touch the pins. Now we're going to be mounting the AFC Lite to the mount. And in order to do that, we're going to orient it like this. And just try and dry fit it, make sure everything lines up. One thing that I noticed with mine, and this is common with the early revisions, is we've got a little bit of an issue here with this power switch. So you can see it kind of would sag, or it would kind of bend the mount here. So we're going to go ahead and trim these ends with some flush cutters. So I'm just going to go in here. I don't need to take off much, but I'm going to take off just the bottom part of it a little bit there. And watch out, these will eject. Make sure you have some good eye protection on. Alright, so now they're pretty much the same depth as these other pins. So we shouldn't have that issue anymore. Now everything's just laying down nice. And once you have that aligned, you're only going to sink your M3x8s in this section right here. We're going to leave those open for now. Just line them up. And they're self-threading. I've got them both lined up. They're going in. They're threading. So now we're just going to pick this up and tighten them down. And they are going to pop through a little bit. At this point, it's a good idea to go ahead and flash your board. And in order to flash your board, you're going to need to make sure you can power your board, and you're going to need to power it with the 24 volt, which is the connectors here. So if you're doing CAN on the bottom, but you're going to have low and high and ground and 24 volt here. So it'll be low, high, ground, 24 volt, kind of in that order. Make sure you double check the polarity before you make the cable. If you're going to run USB like I am, you're still going to need 24 volt. But you're also going to need to connect your USB here. I've got my Raspberry Pi here, I've got my AFC Lite here, and I've got a USB-C port connecting the two of them. I'm going to set mine up in USB mode, which means when I'm running this, I'm going to be running it like this in the printer. I'm also going to need to eventually power this with 24 volt. So when you go to flash your board, if you just want to install, if you want to do that step now, like the manual suggests, this is a pretty easy way to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and power up my Raspberry Pi. Make sure that your switch here is on USB. And once we're done with this, we're also going to need to set it back to buck. And that's how it's going to run when it's installed. But for now, since I'm just flashing the firmware, I need to go ahead and set this switch to USB mode. So I'm going to go ahead and power this up. You're probably not going to see anything other than that, those blue lights on the board. So none of these other components are going to have power when it's in USB mode, which is what we want. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up SSH to my Raspberry Pi, and I'll be using the instructions. This is for CAN, this top part here. The bottom part is for firmware flashing over USB, so you can follow along there. And I'll go ahead and change directory to Klipper. After that, I'll make clean, and now we'll open up make menu config to set the options. And you can follow along here in your make menu config, but you'll just want to select the same options that I'm choosing here. The settings are all documented in the AFC Lite documentation, so be sure to check that out. And be very careful as you're setting this. Make sure you pick the exact settings shown. And I'm going to go quickly here, and this is what the final options look like. And let's go ahead and save. And then once you save, you can run make. And that should compile everything needed. Before we can put the firmware on, we need to set this into DFU mode, or device firmware update mode. And it needs to be powered up while you're doing this, so blue lights are on. Come in here and hold your boot button, hit the reset button, and then let go of the boot button. And you should be good. You should only have that one light on. Now I'd like to go back to our terminal and confirm that we're in DFU mode by running LSUSB. And I ran LSUSB before I put the device into firmware mode, which is the first section there. And then I ran it after I put it in, and you'll see that there's DFU mode highlighted there. So that's how you know you're in the correct mode to flash. At this point, you can just run make flash by typing in make flash, and then flash underscore device equals what I've got typed in here. Just be sure that you type that in correctly. After that, you're going to see a series of steps. You will get an error, but don't panic. If you see what we've got there, everything should be in good shape. And now that the device is flashed, it's a good idea just to power it off, power it back on. We're going to check it with a command ls/dev/serial/byid, and you're going to see your device ID, and you should have something that looks like this, and it should contain STM32H723. After you flash the firmware, go ahead and unplug the USB cord. Before you install this into your printer, pretty much from here on out, you need to flip this to the buck position. You can burn the firmware like I did without powering 24 volt. And in the future, if we ever need to flash the firmware again, we can still leave it in this position because we're going to have 24 volt wired. Take the extrusion on the opposite side of the fan from the side, remove that, make sure that the smaller side is facing down. So you can either slide them in like this. They should have a little bit of pressure when you push on it, if it's in right. Or you can also just snap it in like this. So take like a hex key and just go like that. So I mean, you can even install them without removing this if you want, but it does make everything else a little simpler when this is removed. And we'll work on aligning this later, but the board is basically going to go in and just set in place right about there. Now moving along, we're going to insert the lane 4 spooler, and make sure that you grab the one that's labeled lane 4, and you should see that at the end of the wire if you're using the LDO kit. Just go ahead and tuck that in, and there are tabs here, and these tabs will slot into this extrusion, and you're just going to want to, you'll hear it click, just kind of set it into place. And you shouldn't see anything above here. It should just rest right on top of this extrusion and those tabs within the back of this extrusion. And once you get that piece in there, just go ahead and flip it over, and you're going to put 2 M3/8 into here. I'll go ahead and show how that goes in. It should just drop right into place. I'm just going to go ahead and tighten that one down, and then just repeat for the other side. It may take a second to get them lined up, but they will eventually go in. I went ahead and flip this around just so it's a little easier to access and similar to the manual. Next step, you're going to take your lane 4 prep here, and these both will have the longest wires. And we're just going to line this up where this switch is going to touch this trigger. This switch needs to be closed in the closed position. So it's open when it's like that. It's closed when it's like that. So we're going to move it to where it's closed, and we're going to tighten it down. Now let's test it. Okay. Now it's open. Now it's closed. Open, closed. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my lane 4 extruder here. Load 4, it should say. Now you want to make sure you got it oriented correctly, which should be like this. And we're going to install it with 2 M3/8 into these holes. The manual also talks about connecting these Bowden tubes. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't have those tubes ready, but I don't think it's a bad idea to do that. I just don't have my Bowden tubes prepared yet. And then I'll repeat for the back. And those went in pretty easy. Make them nice and snug. And I just want to point out a couple things. I went ahead and added a zip tie here. There's a lot of little holes underneath this mesh where you can add zip ties. And based on the manual, you want to go kind of, all the zip ties you're going to add are going to be right around in here. One thing that I just probably didn't notice and had to ask around, these are going to, you don't have to worry about zip tying these down. These will be connected to each other, so they're kind of daisy chained together. The manual does talk about this, but not until around page 35, so I was a little confused by this. But just leave that kind of hanging there. And at this point, we're just going to go ahead and repeat this process for the remaining pieces here. All right, I've got both 4 and 3 respoolers done, and they install exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and start zip tying these wires. Make sure that you undo your rubber bands on your motor wires. And this is why it's so important to have your numbers correct on these, because like number 4, it's going to go all the way. That's going to be the longest wire. Number 3, as you can see here, it's going to be the second longest, and so on. And same thing with these other wires. It's a nice thing, one of the nice benefits of the LDO kit. Before I get started on lane 2, I think I'm going to just add one more zip tie here to keep it from getting real messy. I don't want it getting in the way of the screws here. And if you're like me, you might have missed the zip tie step on these guys. Go ahead and add that now if you want. It'll help keep the wiring even cleaner. And there they are, a little bit cleaner with those zip ties. When you're doing the third extruder, make sure you include your hub wire in the zip tie bundle. At this point, I've got everything ran in terms of the wiring. Now I've got this big mess of connectors, and that is going to simply go into my board. You can do this as you go, like the manual says, or you can do it all at the end. I figured I'd do it all at the end just to make it a little simpler for me. Before I go much further, I want to show you how to do the Bowden tube part. And I'm going to be talking about everything. I'm going to be talking about the Bowden tubes between the extruder and this hub part here. And you're going to need your smaller 2mm inner diameter PTFE tube. And you can definitely tell a difference. So here is the 3mm inner diameter tube. But basically, all I'm going to do is take this tube, measure it out to the appropriate length. You're going to need 2 that are 101mm, which is this piece here that I've already done. And then you're going to need 2 for the outer lanes that are 171mm or thereabouts. I'm going to line it up. I'm doing the 101mm right now. So I'm going to line it up as best as I can. And then I'm going to mark it with this little Sharpie. So I've got that marked now. And I use one of these, which is just a 3D printed cutter. Capricorn also sells this tool, which is pretty nice, though you can't really see where the line is. This one you can see exactly where you're going to cut. So I can see that little faint blue line right there. And at this point, I'm just going to push down, and boom, it's cut. And it makes a nice flush cut. Before you install this Bowden tube into the extruder here, you're going to need to do a bevel cut on it, only on the inside. So I went ahead and got this 60-degree center point router bit. And there's other tools that you could use, but this is the one that I thought I'd try. So what you're going to do is just come in here and twist it around and get a nice bevel. And just do that a few times. You kind of keep an eye on it, but here's what it looks like unbeveled. So you can see it's just flush, and you get the 2mm right there. And beveled, you get it looks like a little bit wider opening. What it's doing is it's just cutting that V cut into the end of it, and that's going to allow the filament to enter in there a little bit easier. Before you install it, I recommend just blowing it out and then running a piece of filament through it to clear all the PTFE chips out. Because if you don't do that, those chips will eventually get into your hot end and cause a jam. And hopefully that focuses, but you can get an idea of what that bevel, a nice bevel, will look like. And it only took about maybe 10-15 seconds to get that. And if you had a hobby knife, you would kind of do the same thing. Just stick the end of the hobby knife in here and slowly twist it around. Now I'm going to go ahead and install it. And it's really easy to install. You're just going to come over here, insert into this end, and then you're going to insert it into the other end of the hub here, just like that. And now I've just got to complete these two pieces. These are going to be my 171 millimeter lengths. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and install this last piece. And there we go. You're going to be using the 3 millimeter inner diameter Bowden tube for these parts here, from the spooler to the extruder. And you're going to use the jig for that, and you're going to cut it at the 80 millimeter part. Make sure you push this all the way in, so it's kind of bottoming out on this. And then you're going to take a nice sharp tool. I'm using this tool here. And then you're just going to insert that into that slot as good as you can and cut. And then you should have a nice flat cut doing it that way. And I'm going to go ahead and just insert them here to test it. There we go. So that should fit in nice and neat. You shouldn't have any kinks. It's easy to kink though because there's not much there. So just kind of watch it and be careful as you insert it in. And we're going to need to have 4 total. Okay, I've got all 4 of the 80 millimeter in here. Once you get it in there, don't worry about it if you have a little bit of a kink. Just try to massage it out, because I don't really think there's a way to get this stuff in here without kinking it. My kit has a little bit left, and we're going to be using this for the outside top later. And for this part, we're just going to use the 50. And it looks like we're going to just have barely enough left. To run your wiring, you're going to need a crimper. I use the PA09, and this works really well. I'll have the link in the description for these. I also use these little automatic wire strippers. They're pretty handy. You need to trim a little bit of your wire, about that much or so. And then you're going to remove one of your pins from this. Make sure the jacket of the wire can be crimped. So you need at least that much in the crimp part here. So I'm going to trim that down just a tiny bit. Once you have your wire about where you need it, it's easier to set this in. I use the 1.4 setting. And I'm just going to set this into the crimper just like that. And once I set that in, I'm going to go ahead and twist my wire to make sure it's nice and round. And then I'll insert it gently in. And I'm using 20 gauge wire here, which is probably a little bigger than what's needed, but it should be fine. Okay, once you get that in there, gently squeeze and do a little bit of a tug test. And you shouldn't have any movement, which I don't. Now I'm going to move down to the 1.9. I'm going to insert this in. Very gentle pressure. Just crimp that over. And that's what that should look like. Okay, I'm pretty happy with those, and now I'm going to go ahead and insert them into the connectors. Before you insert, make sure you understand where these pins need to go. 24 volt is here in the upper left, ground is here. So we're going to go ahead and push this in. And once these go in, they typically want to stay in. So make sure you get them right. Otherwise, it might be a little bit difficult removing them. And when you insert these, you should hear them snap in. And if you don't hear them snap in, then they're not going to stay in. You might have to rotate them around a little bit. And then once you get them in there and hear that click, go ahead and insert them. And do a little bit of a tug test. They shouldn't come out. Those look pretty good. There's nothing exposed on the outside. And now you can repeat for your can, high and low. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and connect everything up. You can see I've taken my AFC Lite board here, and I've connected it with 2 M310 screws, and I've got about that amount of distance. If I need to adjust it, I can always just come in here, loosen these up, and then slide it. But I think that'll be good. The other thing that I've done, since I'm doing this at the end, I went ahead and created this just handy cross-reference based on what's in the manual. We're going to be connecting everything to this section here. So I'm going to use this as a reference rather than having to keep changing pages. And there's also this visual from the Armored Turtle AFC Lite pinout page. And the first things I plugged in are these motors, the M20 motors here, and they're just labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the LDO kit. And they just go sequentially 1, 2, 3, and 4. And next up, I've connected my steppers. You got 1, 2, 3, and 4. My fourth one, the piece fell off, but luckily I had 1 through 3 still labeled. And then after that, we've got these load preps, and that's going to be fun because there's a lot of these, but they're all clearly labeled. You can see here that I've got all the prep and load connected, and it was definitely handy having that sheet where I could easily look things up and reference it. I've also connected my 24-volt and ground. If you have CAN, you'll have your wires here as well, but since I'm using USB, I omitted those for now. And here's your RGB piece. You're going to connect that to the RGB1, and then we're going to go ahead and daisy chain all of these LEDs together. And a daisy chain, we're just going to connect this piece here. And from there, we'll do the same thing and just repeat till we get to the end. And there's only one way these can go in, so you shouldn't have to worry about getting them mixed up. At the very end, we will have an open one, and that's okay. I'm just going to try to clean this up a little bit, just so it's not as messy. A nice little bundle there. It'll just help keep it a little bit tamed. And you might want to double check that everything is nice and snug in these connectors before you secure everything. And while you're in here, you might as well go ahead and add your buffer 1 and buffer 2. And those are going to go in position 11 and 12, which are the very bottom ones here. Okay, and just a little tip, when you're getting this set in, go ahead and loosen these up a little bit so they can move around, and just adjust it so you're able to fit this in and snap it in. I'm just going to go ahead and sink the other screw on this extrusion here and tighten it down. Okay, that one's tight, and then I'm going to tighten this bottom one as well. And you may notice I don't have my fan connected, but that's definitely something I can connect. I'm also going to go ahead and tighten this down now that I've got it about where I want it and it's not in the way. And then feel free to add more zip ties if you want. This is going to route out the bottom. There's a kind of a hole down here right above the fan. And this is what's going to, of course, connect to your power supply and your CAN if you're running CAN. I'm also going to be running a USB cable. So I'm going to connect this USB here. I'm probably going to have to get a 90-degree adapter also because that's going to be a pretty tight connection. We are going to have feet on this, but that's something to be aware of. You may need a 90-degree if you're going to go USB. And you can put some like sleeve, like a textile braid sleeve on here if you want, which I'll probably do eventually. That way it'll keep everything nice and tidy. And one of the last steps is you need to cut a 250 millimeter or so PTFE tube and connect it here. I'm just going to hold off on that for now because I'm not quite ready to get this thing installed. To finish up the general assembly, we're going to need these roller parts here and the threaded parts and these bearings. And this is pretty simple. You're just going to go ahead and twist this part in here. It should thread in if your printer's calibrated well. I had a brim on these parts, so I'm just scraping that off a little bit here. And then just twist in the other side and lock those into place. These bearings are going to go on either end of it. You should just be able to snap them into place. They may be a little tight, a little bit of a snug fit, but they'll go on. There we go. And just repeat for the other side. Repeat that for the rest of them. And I've got all 4 done. And if you want to check these out, you can just drop them in here. And they should fit pretty snugly and rotate freely. Cool, everything seems to check out. Now we're in the very final steps of the manual, and you're going to need 4 heat inserts in these solid corner parts. This is going to just help us to kind of button everything up. And I'll just go ahead and insert those and repeat. By now you should be a pro at this. Okay, that one's good. I'll just repeat for the other 3. For the feet, you're going to need your rubber feet. The LDO kit includes them, otherwise you'll print them. You're going to need some M5x10 washers and M5x16 screws. You should have 4 left at this point. And you're also going to need these M5 hex nuts, and we're going to go ahead and set this up. So take your M516, M5 washer, and one of your feet, and you're going to go through this way. And it's just going to go into this plastic part here. And it should just pop right into place. And then we're going to thread it through that hex nut. This may be a little challenging due to the angle, but you should be able to hold it in place there. Go ahead and tighten it down. And that should hold in place. There we go. And then just repeat that for the other 3 corners. And something else to note, just make sure this goes along the outside edge. There's a little bit of a raised lip, and that just needs to go on the outside. And there's really only one way to fit them anyway, because you have this indentation. This next one will just go right here like that. As you can see, I've got all 4 feet on now. Just make sure everything's pretty tight. If it's a little loose, just don't be afraid to tighten that down a little bit more. And to finish up the assembly, we're going to need an M36, and this will just go right into the corner, and you'll thread right through this hole here. And just repeat that for the other 3 corners. All right, we've got all the corners on. If you do happen to have challenges while you're doing these corners, make sure your extrusions are square. There's little tabs here that have to slide in. And if these extrusions aren't square on the corners, you're going to have a problem inserting them. The only thing remaining at this point are just adding your 50mm Bowden tubes here. And you want the 3mm inner diameter of those. And just go ahead and use your jig again for this part. Just go ahead and use your jig again for this part. So you're going to cut the shorter one, which is the 50. And I went ahead and made mine about 40, so I've got a little insert here. But you shouldn't need to do that if you've got enough length. But I want all mine to be equal. So go ahead and push that all the way in so you're bottoming out on this edge. And then we're just going to go ahead and slice it up. And you need 4 of these pieces. And to finish up, I'm just going to insert this piece here on the end, and it should be a pretty snug fit. And then go ahead and insert that into this guy here, into your spooler. And now I've got all 4 in. And that concludes the general assembly. So I will be having some future videos on how to get this up and running and configured. But for now, I've got to go off and build my fill matrix.